Spartacus wasn't just Stanley Kubrick's most reluctant film. It was a $12 million production built on wounded ego, competing blacklists, and a war between the director and his producer, so total that it permanently ended their relationship and drove one of cinema's greatest auteurs out of Hollywood forever. We are digging into the wreckage of Spartacus with 15 secrets the studio tried to bury, secrets locked inside censorship board filings, out-of-print production memoirs, the private complaints of blacklisted writers, and the bitter testimony of actors who spent years on a set where no one trusted anyone. The entire production of Spartacus began with a snub. Kirk Douglas had campaigned vigorously for the title role in William Wyler's Ben-Hur and lost it to Charlton Heston. The two men occupied the same rung of Hollywood's mid-century masculine hierarchy. Both were physically formidable, both commanded enormous box office, and both had spent the 1950s building careers on the kinds of heroic roles that the epic genre required. Wyler chose Heston. Douglas, who processed professional rejection the way most people process it, badly and productively, instructed his production company Bryna to find him something comparable. Edward Lewis, a Bryna vice president, had already read Howard Fast's 1951 novel about a Thracian slave who led a rebellion against Rome. The symmetry was obvious. If Douglas couldn't play the man who conquered Jerusalem, he would play the man who nearly conquered Rome. He optioned the book with his own money. Bryna Productions announced a production deal with Universal in March 1958 with a proposed budget of $4 million. It would end up costing 3 times that. The insult that planted the seed was the smallest thing that happened during the next 3 years. But the real problem was that the man Douglas hired to write the script had his own unfinished war with the institution that had destroyed him. Howard Fast had written his novel Spartacus under circumstances that gave the source material its particular moral urgency. He had written it in 1950, while blacklisted from mainstream publishing following his refusal to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and had published it himself. When Douglas hired Fast to adapt his own novel into a screenplay, the results, delivered after 60 days, were, in Douglas's unambiguous judgment, a disaster unusable. Fast's draft had reproduced the ideological clarity of the novel without the narrative architecture a film required. Douglas turned to Dalton Trumbo. This was not a straightforward creative decision. Trumbo was one of the Hollywood 10, the group of writers and directors who had refused to cooperate with the House Un-American Activities Committee, been convicted of contempt of Congress, and served federal prison sentences. He had spent the decade since his release in 1950 writing screenplays under pseudonyms and through frontmen, winning 2 Academy Awards he could not collect under his own name. Douglas hired Trumbo under the pseudonym Sam Jackson, with payments directed accordingly. Trumbo, who intensely disliked Fast and found his Marxist framework narrow, completed a treatment in 2 weeks, a pace that allowed Douglas and Universal to outmaneuver Yul Brynner's rival Spartacus project, which had been developing simultaneously at United Artists with Martin Ritt directing. The question of what name would appear on the screen credit produced a scene that Douglas documented in his autobiography with visible disgust. In a meeting with Kubrick and producer Edward Lewis, the discussion turned to how to handle Trumbo's credit given his continued blacklist status. Lewis vetoed his own name. Kubrick then volunteered his offer to take public credit for another man's work. Douglas and Lewis found this suggestion revolting. The next day, Douglas called the Universal Gate and arranged a visitor's pass for Dalton Trumbo, who walked onto a studio lot for the first time in 10 years. Trumbo said simply, "Thanks, Kirk, for giving me back my name." The public announcement of Trumbo's credit came in August 1960, 7 months after Otto Preminger had already announced Trumbo's involvement in Exodus, meaning that even in the act of breaking the blacklist, the timing deprived Douglas of sole credit for it. That particular irony would not have surprised anyone on the production. This is exactly why the film Kubrick then made felt, to everyone involved, like it belonged to someone else. David Lean was the first choice to direct Spartacus. He turned it down. Anthony Mann, best known for the Jimmy Stewart westerns he had made throughout the 1950s, Winchester 73, The Naked Spur, The Man from Laramie, was hired in his place. Mann had ghost-directed Quo Vadis in 1951 and understood the specific grammar of the Roman epic. He began shooting in January 1959. By some accounts, he lasted 1 week, by others 3. The quarrel between Mann and Douglas was documented most clearly by Mann himself, shortly before his death in 1967. Douglas wanted the film's anti-slavery message placed at the forefront, carried by dialogue and explicit statement. Mann believed the message would reach the audience more powerfully through visual means, through the physical depiction of what slavery actually looked like. "A film must be visual," he said. "Too much dialogue kills it." Douglas, who was the producer and the star simultaneously, fired Mann and called Stanley Kubrick. Kubrick had cooperated with Douglas on Paths of Glory 2 years earlier, a film whose tight budget and clear moral vision had allowed Kubrick the kind of control he required. He arrived at Spartacus having not made a film in 2 years, handed a copy of the script, and given a weekend to take over a production that was already in motion, on a stage he had not designed, with casting decisions almost entirely made without his input, shooting footage he had not planned. His request to reshoot everything Mann had already captured was refused. His offer to rewrite the script was refused. He was, for the only time in his career, a director for hire with the emphasis on hire. The experience produced in Kubrick a resolution so absolute that he never worked on those terms again. After Spartacus, he maintained total creative control over every project he touched, from story development through final cut until the end of his life. The film he hated making taught him precisely what he required in order to make films he could respect. But the real problem was that even after Kubrick arrived, the production's battles had only just begun. The intellectual genealogy of Spartacus is more complicated than its single screenplay credit suggests. Trumbo wrote the script, but was blacklisted and therefore invisible during production. He could not be on set, could not attend meetings, could not respond in real time to the constant demands for rewrites that a production of this scale generates. The vacuum his absence created was filled, partially and sometimes chaotically, by the cast. Laurence Olivier researched Roman equestrian practices and discovered that Romans rode without saddles, then rode saddleless in his horseback scenes, a decision made entirely independently of director or writer. Charles Laughton threatened to sue Douglas multiple times during filming, in disputes that Douglas characterized as prima donna behavior, but which partly reflected Laughton's genuine unhappiness with material he found beneath his abilities. Peter Ustinov, understanding that Laughton's continued participation required something more interesting to say, rewrote all of the scenes he shared with Laughton, producing the witty, world-weary exchanges between Gracchus and Batiatus that many critics consider the film's most pleasurable sequences. Ustinov was never credited for this. When praised for the dialogue in those scenes, Trumbo accepted the compliment without mentioning that he had not written a word of what was being praised. Meanwhile, Kubrick had his own script objections that nobody was satisfying. He felt the Spartacus character, as written by Trumbo and endorsed by Douglas, was too mythic, too perfect, insufficiently human, that Trumbo and Douglas had created a figure of political symbolism rather than a man. His attempts to introduce complexity into the characterization were blocked by Douglas, who had a clear and unwavering vision of what Spartacus represented and was not interested in ambiguity. Trumbo, in a 13-page document he wrote after production completed and shared with colleagues under the title of Report on Spartacus, complained that Kubrick had been systematically making his protagonist small, cutting, diminishing, and undercutting the heroic stature that the script required. Two men with legitimate creative arguments, unable to communicate them directly, working against each other on a film neither fully controlled. This is exactly why the film's opening hour, the gladiator school sequences, where Kubrick had the most freedom and the fewest competing agendas, remains visibly superior to everything that follows. The conflict between Kubrick and his cinematographer Russell Meddy produced one of the more unusual solutions in the history of American film production. Meddy had built his career working with directors who allowed the natural movement of actors and the organic logic of scenes to determine camera placement. His work with Douglas Sirk on Written on the Wind and Imitation of Life had been defined by an instinctive visual fluency. Kubrick wanted something different, precisely composed frames, controlled perspectives, multiple takes until each shot satisfied his conception. The two men's approaches were incompatible, and the disputes between them escalated to the point where Kubrick began shooting significant portions of the film himself, physically taking over the camera and locking Meddy out of his own position. Meddy, who was present for these usurpations and apparently accepted them with some combination of pragmatism and fury, received the Academy Award for Best Cinematography for his work on the film, which is one of the more quietly absurd outcomes in Oscar history, given that a significant portion of the photography was not his. Kubrick, who had done the shooting, received no credit for it and gave no interviews about it. The statue went to the man who had been displaced. The industry moved on. The production decision surrounding Woody Strode's death scene is one of the more visceral footnotes in the film's making, and it has been consistently under-examined in the historical literature. Strode played Draba, the gladiator, who, in the film's moral turning point, defeats Spartacus in the arena and then, rather than deliver the killing blow, hurls his trident at Crassus in the patrician gallery and attempts to scale the wall. Crassus kills him with the almost offhand ease of a man dismissing an insect. Draba's body is then hung upside down in the gladiators' quarters as a warning. The effect is the rebellion's true trigger. The warning achieves the opposite of its intent. The production planned to use a replica of Strode for the hanging scene. The replica was unsatisfactory. Strode himself was therefore hung upside down, ropes tied around his ankles, suspended over the set, for the duration of the filming of the sequence, while his fellow cast members filed past him in silence. He did not flinch or twitch. His son Kalai later noted that the unused replica hung inside the entrance to Universal's prop room for years afterward, a wax effigy of a living man, collecting dust in the dark. Strode's Golden Globe nomination for Best Supporting Actor, his only career nomination from that organization, remains one of the least discussed acknowledgments in the award's history. But the real problem was that the studio's treatment of Strode's performance was characteristic of how the production handled the most politically uncomfortable elements of its own story. Kirk Douglas documented in his memoir I Am Spartacus that Universal Pictures, exercising its contractual right to final cut prior to distribution, made 42 cuts to the completed film without his knowledge or approval. The cuts came under pressure from the Production Code Administration and the New York Legion of Decency, the Roman Catholic watchdog organization that had monitored Hollywood content since 1936. Among the excised material, 2 shots of Gene Simmons completely nude, a scene in which Crassus slits Draba's throat, a soldier's arm being cut off with visible blood, a suicide made more implicit, and the entire 4-minute snails and oysters bathhouse sequence in which Crassus, bathed by Antoninus, suggests through elaborate culinary metaphor that his sexual appetites encompass both men and women. The Legion of Decency had a specific suggested remedy for the oysters and snails sequence. Replace the offending shellfish with artichokes and truffles, on the theory that the metaphorical subtext would become less legible with different vegetables. Douglas and Kubrick, in the rare moment of agreement their relationship permitted, rejected this proposal and chose instead to remove the scene entirely. The Production Code Administration additionally required that Kubrick tone down the battle sequence violence. Arms lopped off with spurting blood were shortened or removed. The Legion rated the film A3, morally unobjectionable for adults, only after these interventions were complete. The film that reached theaters in October 1960 was, by Douglas's count, 42 decisions removed from the film he had made. This is exactly why the 1991 restoration was not a restoration of something historical. It was the completion of something interrupted. The 1991 restoration, coordinated by Robert Harris and James Katz, recovered the excised footage from Universal's vaults in sufficient visual condition for reinsertion. The snails and oysters scene existed as picture, intact, clear, fully shot. Its soundtrack did not. The audio had been lost, apparently destroyed during a period of studio archival negligence in the 1970s, along with other materials from the film. Tony Curtis, 65 at the time of the restoration, returned to re-record his side of the bathhouse dialogue. Laurence Olivier had died in July 1989. His widow, Joan Plowright, suggested Anthony Hopkins, a Welsh actor whose technical range included apparently a credible Olivier impersonation. Hopkins recorded Crassus's dialogue, received a special thanks credit in the restored version, and the scene was reinserted after 31 years. The result is one of cinema's stranger collaborative artifacts, a scene performed in 1959 by 2 actors, one of whom died before it could be restored, his voice replaced by a third man imitating him well enough to pass. Kubrick, living in London and communicating with the restoration team by phone and fax, provided detailed instructions on how to play the scene, his first direct creative involvement with Spartacus in 3 decades. He had disowned the film. He helped restore it anyway. The political pressure surrounding Spartacus did not dissipate when the film opened. Hedda Hopper, the Hollywood columnist whose conservative politics were indistinguishable from her professional identity, published denunciations of the film before its release. The American Legion organized boycotts. John Wayne, who had publicly condemned Trumbo's credit as Marxist propaganda, called the film an affront to American values. The production was attacked as communist agitprop by the Hollywood right, with an intensity that, in October 1960, 4 weeks before a presidential election, carried genuine political weight. President-elect John F. Kennedy crossed an American Legion picket line outside a Washington theater to see the film 2 weeks after his election. He did this publicly, with press present, in full awareness that the gesture would be interpreted as political commentary. It was. The picket line was a statement. Crossing it was a counterstatement. The most powerful elected official in the United States had just declared with his feet that the Hollywood blacklist was finished. It was not finished. These things never end cleanly, but Kennedy's deliberate, visible decision to see a film written by a convicted communist over the explicit objections of organized anti-communist groups represented a moment of cultural legitimation that no studio announcement or awards ceremony could have manufactured. The final sequence of Spartacus, in which Varinia holds up their infant son before Spartacus's crucified body and tells the child that his father died free, was the product of Douglas's vision rather than Kubrick's. Kubrick wanted an ending bleaker and more unresolved, consistent with the moral world of Paths of Glory, in which institutional power always wins and the deaths of the virtuous leave no residue of hope. Douglas insisted on the redemptive coda, the child born free, the sacrifice given meaning, the defeat transformed into a kind of victory. The argument between them was not merely aesthetic, it was theological. Douglas, a passionate Zionist whose framework for the film drew explicit parallels between the slave rebellion and Jewish historical experience, needed the story to contain the possibility of continuity, of survival after catastrophe. Kubrick, whose worldview admitted no such consolations, found the ending sentimental. The ending Douglas wanted is the ending the film has. Kubrick told interviewers for the rest of his life that Spartacus did not represent his work. The final budget of Spartacus exceeded $12 million, making it, at the time of its completion, the most expensive film ever produced primarily in Hollywood. It had begun with a proposed budget of $4 million and escalated with a consistency that suggests not mismanagement but inevitability. 8,000 Spanish army soldiers were hired to play Roman legions, spending 6 weeks rehearsing and 6 more weeks filming battle sequences directed from 3 110-foot towers. Italian museums and costume houses supplied 5,000 uniforms and 7 tons of armor. Kubrick's obsession with retakes, his insistence on realism, his numbered cardboard signs distributed among the fallen extras so he could reposition them by shouting their numbers across the field, all of this consumed time and money with the thoroughness of a siege. In a financial detail that has received insufficient emphasis, the $12 million budget exceeded the total assessed value of Universal Studios itself, which had been sold to MCA during production for $11,125,000. The film cost more than the studio that was releasing it. Bosley Crowther in the New York Times called the film a spotty, uneven drama that came out as a romantic mishmash of a strange episode in history. He set Douglas's horse opera style unfavorably against Lawton's toga-clad precision and Olivier's Roman-nosed gentility, a comparison that accurately identified a tonal inconsistency but failed to account for why that inconsistency existed. Crowther was not wrong that the film was uneven. He was not asking why it was uneven, or what institutional forces had produced the unevenness, or whether a film assembled from the competing visions of 7 significant creative personalities, all of whom had contradictory arguments about what it was for, might contain something more interesting than its surface irregularities suggested. Stanley Kaufman in The New Republic called it entertaining if mindless, the kind of dismissal that closes off inquiry with the efficiency of a locked door. The critics were reviewing the tension, they were not investigating its source. But the algorithm of history has vindicated Spartacus in ways that its 1960 reviewers were structurally prevented from recognizing. The restored 1991 version, with its bisexual Crassus, its fuller violence, its 23 additional minutes of moral complexity, is a different film from what played in 1960 theaters, and it is a better one. The snails and oysters sequence, which the Legion of Decency found obscene and which the studio buried for 30 years, is now understood as one of the most quietly radical moments in classical Hollywood cinema. Trumbo writing, through the oblique grammar of Roman allegory, that sexual orientation is a matter of preference rather than morality, a position that would not appear in mainstream American cultural discourse for another decade. The film's McCarthyite subtext, which was politically pointed in 1960, has been confirmed as politically permanent. Crassus's manipulation of institutional power, his ability to use fear and law and loyalty to enforce conformity, remains as recognizable as the day it was written by a man who had been imprisoned for refusing to confirm it. The production that looked like ego and chaos was, beneath its turbulent surface, a systematic dismantling of every mechanism through which power silences dissent. Kubrick left the production of Spartacus and left Hollywood permanently. He moved to England and never returned to work in the American film industry under American conditions. He and Douglas never reconciled. Douglas, in the formulation he repeated across interviews and memoirs, called Kubrick a talented bastard, adding the talented as a modification that felt, in context, less like a compliment than a clarification. Kubrick, for his part, described Spartacus as the proof that he could not work without total control and treated the film's existence in his filmography with the specific detachment of a man acknowledging a fact he would prefer not to discuss. Peter Ustinov's young daughter, asked by a reporter during the production what her father did for a living, replied simply, "Spartacus." The filming had consumed so much of his life that it had become his identity in the eyes of his child. The studio that made the film was worth less than the film cost. The director who made it was so unhappy making it that he never made another film on those terms. And here is the question that Spartacus embeds in its structure with the persistence of a slave who refuses to stay down. When an institution, a studio, a government, a blacklist attempts to suppress the creative or political work of individuals by controlling the conditions under which they are permitted to speak, does it succeed? The Hollywood blacklist imprisoned Dalton Trumbo, destroyed careers, and produced a decade of anonymous and pseudonymous work. It also produced Spartacus, a $12 million argument made with 8,000 soldiers and 42 unauthorized cuts, and a dead man's voice dubbed by a Welshman for the proposition that no institution can permanently silence the people it attempts to erase. Leave that in the comments. The argument is the point. If this investigation changed how you see Spartacus, leave a like, because there are 1,000 films with buried secrets that deserve the same forensic attention, and the algorithm needs to know this kind of digging matters.